We have a power in North Korea that is erratic, unpredictable, and increasingly dangerous.
North Korea is dangerous. It's dangerous as a strong nation with a big arsenal and an arsenal of very destructive weapons, and it's also a danger as a weak nation, as a nation that could fail.
Korea is a U.S.-China issue because we are allied with South Korea, the Chinese are allied with North Korea, and of course in the last Korean War we fought the Chinese for that same reason, and so you have to worry.
In Korea, United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists. An advance whose purpose, General Ridgway states, is not to seize ground, but to wipe out the enemy. The Chinese Red Army, fighting desperately in small isolated stands, prefers to give ground on wider fronts rather than join battle. And it's up to the infantry to clear out the pockets of die-hard communists.
The Korean War started because the Soviet Union, North Korea, and China miscalculated the U.S. bottom line. The Chinese entered the war because the United States miscalculated the Chinese bottom line when we authorized the UN forces to cross the 38th parallel. And if we can't calculate the bottom lines of the other side, we can't control escalation with any degree of confidence.
North Korea still does not accept the armistice with South Korea in any meaningful way, at least not in the interest of a peace treaty.
It's a country that doesn't have peace, essentially. It's in a war-like situation. There's an armistice, but nothing more.
Now, North Korea has been deterred from launching another invasion for decades based on America's commitment and now South Korea's strength, and you would think that would be durable.
It's a country which is a de facto nuclear power with a highly unpredictable leader.
We're facing off against an even more provocative leader in North Korea, if that's possible, with Kim Jong-un, the young heir of a brutal dynasty that is determined to build nuclear weapons and threaten the surrounding nations.
North Korea now has maybe 10 or 12 nuclear weapons. That may make them feel more powerful, even though they've lost their Soviet ally from the Cold War days. So I don't see the basis for great hopefulness at the moment. So you still have a couple of scenarios that could lead to war. One of them is North Korean internal state collapse or strife, competition within North Korea over power, which could then lead to conflict, uncertainty about where North Korea's nuclear weapons are, some people taking potshots at South Korea out of whatever reason. That could just lead to an unpredictable dynamic.
It's easy to imagine North Korea collapsing and a conflict breaking out between North and South Korea that pulls the United States and the Chinese in.
If there were to be instability in North Korea, the first thing, if that instability threatened to spill over borders, if it was really a major crisis, not just economic instability, but political instability, the United States and South Korean forces have in place plans to go north very quickly over the 38th parallel to secure these facilities of weapons of mass destruction, certainly nuclear, but also biological and chemical. Some of these facilities are very close to China's borders. They are within 100 kilometers.
If the North implodes, it either implodes peacefully or it implodes through conflict. But in South Korea takes over the peninsula. That's the vision that most people have for unification, right? China is going to be very uncomfortable with an American presence on the peninsula, especially if it's a presence that moves north up close to the Yalu River.
We could end up with 3 countries, the United States, South Korea, and China, with boots on the ground in North Korea, acting at potentially cross purposes. We could end up in another war, not something that anybody would like to see.
At the end of the day, the number one worst case scenario for China is a collapse of the regime. And they fundamentally don't trust that we are not primarily seeking that.
I personally worry about a collapse in North Korea in which there's miscommunication, so that the South Koreans and the United States forces that are in South Korea are somehow drawn in to stability missions in Northern Korea. And the Chinese hawks don't agree with letting either South Korean forces or American forces cross the border into the north at all, even though it's a collapse and the security of nuclear weapons in North Korea might be of concern to us. In theory, we could work this out cooperatively.
And then you have the question of how are we going to cooperate on going after the nuclear materials that we know North Korea holds. All this creates opportunities for U.S.-China collaboration, but right now we're not pursuing that because the Chinese won't talk to us about contingency planning. So there's the risk the two sides come into North Korea, each for their own purposes, without coordination, without communication, and wind up eyeball to eyeball on different sides of the campaign. That's not a pretty picture.
The dirty secret is America's allies, and even the United States, doesn't want to see a Korea that comes apart in a totally uncontrollable way because nobody knows what the consequences are. So a lot of people talk a very tough game on North Korea, but nobody wants to deal with, the Chinese included, dealing with what the implications of a Korea that exploded would be.
A second scenario that could lead to war is like in 2010, as well as in certain periods in the past when North Korea did terrible things to the South Koreans.
Like we saw in 2010 with the torpedoing of the Chonan and the shelling of Yongpyeong-do, which killed South Korean soldiers, civilians.
South Korea's western island of Yongpyeong became a battleground today after North Korea began shelling the island, leaving buildings burning and the island's 1,200 civilians scrambling for cover. Both countries say the other side fired first before they exchanged rounds of artillery for almost an hour. This is the latest episode in a string of aggressive moves by Pyongyang, from nuclear missile tests in 2006 and 2009 to the North's reported involvement in the March sinking of a South Korean warship, killing 46 on board.
They could launch another attack on a South Korean ship, or they could attack another South Korean airliner, as they did in 1987, or try to infiltrate commandos into South Korea, as they did in the mid-1990s. And this could lead to a firm South Korean response.
This type of activity risks getting an immediate reaction from South Korea, particularly these days. The South Koreans, when President Park came in, vowed to essentially not only retaliate, but retaliate one step further if there were to be any further types of actions which would imperil South Korean citizens.
Which could then provoke a counter-response by North Korea, and who knows where that dynamic ends.
If North Korea were to attack the South either conventionally or with nuclear weapons, that North Korea would rather quickly cease to exist as an independent nation.
The Chinese worry about this type of conflict on its border and the fact that you would probably see the U.S. come in helping South Korea, and the result could be a Western-leaning, pro-U.S. government right on China's border, which is something that the Chinese want to avoid.
The Chinese would view any kind of future Korea as of great interest. It's right next to them, and it's the one place on the Eurasian landmass where the United States still has a foothold militarily. And the Chinese probably have just as mixed feelings about that as we would if the Chinese were over in British Columbia or something, or Cuba, with a base of their own in North America. And then, of course, the third possibility is an outright North Korean invasion. That's not very likely in my mind, but you have to be prepared for it.
This has already occurred once in our history, of course, during the 1950s with the Korean War. In that war, it was China and North Korea against South Korea, the UN, and the United States. This could happen again.
If there is a destabilizing dynamic in Korea and you wind up seeing a war, the Chinese are going to be tempted to try to exercise influence in one way or another. They might try to manage the refugee flows out of North Korea into China. And that might be more easily done if they put military force into the northern part of North Korea, rather than wait until people try to cross the Yalu River. In other words, more of a forward position. Or they might try to do something else that brings them into proximity with our troops inadvertently.
And that is indeed a recurring theme from our experts. that Chinese and American military forces might once again find themselves eyeball to eyeball and bayonet to bayonet on the cold and barren landscape of North Korea. But while the scenarios of internal collapse, provocation, and invasion are very dangerous possibilities, the biggest war trigger of all may well turn out to be North Korea's increasing ability to strike the soil of its avowed enemies with nuclear warheads strapped onto the tips of made-in-China missiles.
The Pacific Ocean is not a barrier to threats against us. North Korea is developing nuclear weapons. They're developing ballistic missiles. Over the next decade, they want to put those nuclear weapons on ballistic missiles. And it's not to hit Europe, it's to hit the west coast of the United States.
In terms of its delivery systems, it probably can deliver a nuclear weapon close to its borders, perhaps on South Korea, maybe to Japan, but does not yet have the capability to deliver a nuclear weapon to the United States.
In 2012, we learned that the Chinese sold at least 6 mobile missile launchers to the North Koreans for North Korea's newest missile, the KN-08. The KN-08 is capable of carrying nuclear weapons as far as the American homeland.
And North Korea is developing capability to possibly strike forward bases in Japan and possibly Guam, and maybe even go as far as Alaska or California.
Right. Well, that's the ultimate fear.
I mean, they're going to get pretty good at hitting Los Angeles at some point.
That's probably undeniably true over a long run, and but you still have to deal with the reality. What are you prepared to do to prevent that?
And here the broader question is this: just why has China helped arm an erratic dictator on its border with nuclear weapons to begin with? The answer may only be found in the complex geopolitics of denuclearization and the very different set of grand strategic priorities that China and the United States have for the Korean Peninsula.
The U.S. policy towards North Korea is based to a large extent on China. I mean, we're trying to get China to put pressure on North Korea. It's the largest component, really, of our whole strategy on North Korea.
The U.S. has tried to press China into reining in North Korea. That has produced mixed results.
Both the United States and China oppose North Korea's nuclear weapons programs. It very much serves both countries' interests to achieve denuclearization, and that is the goal that they are striving for. But both the United States and China have really failed in the approaches that have been pursued so far.
What are we doing wrong dealing with China?
Well, on the North Korea issue, we have based our policy, at least since the beginning of this administration, on China changing its position. At least there being some shift in China's position. And there hasn't been.
I think American strategists have at times operated under the assumption that China had the same interests as the United States as regards North Korea, that they were as concerned about North Korea's nuclear weapons programs as we are.
Every time there's been a statement by China about the need for denuclearization, we have this, euphoria that they might be shifting their position.
The Chinese may be concerned about them, but they have other concerns that rank more highly.
China has a different ranking of priorities than we do. Our priorities are getting North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, preventing a conventional war, and maintaining stability on the Korean Peninsula. China's ranking is different. Its number one priority has been either preserving stability or preventing a war that would involve China. Third is getting North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons.
This is the deal. There are two types of analysts in China. They all wish that there were denuclearization. One, even if they push the North Koreans, there's nothing they can do because the decision has been made. And there's many experts on North Korea that will tell you that that's true, that there's no price anymore for a deal. The others believe that they could push North Korea towards denuclearization, but they will get a regime collapse first. So you have two different, one is that there's no doable deal. The others believe that they would have a collapse of the regime by putting pressure on North Korea. So why would they put serious pressure on North Korea?
They certainly don't want to see the Korean Peninsula unified under a democratic government that would be allied to the United States.
The way in which a Korean Peninsula unifies is very much a focal point of Beijing, because if it unifies under South Korea, the assumption is U.S. troops will still be on the ground.
So they may not like the North Koreans.
The Chinese and the North Koreans pretty much detest one another, and China is completely upset and has had enough with North Korea. But it doesn't change the policy.
They may worry about North Korea's nuclear programs, but they don't worry enough actually to do anything to change the outcome.
Xi Jinping especially feels spurned by this little runty 30-year-old, right, who's technically sort of 2 generations away from him. So in Confucian cultures, there should be respect there, which means inform China of a test. Give them more time if you're going to provoke, at least, right? They're not getting any of that, right? But the Chinese mentality is still, they see it as sort of, North Korea is still kind of in the family. So it's like you have a wayward daughter or son. You're going to sort of punish them. You're going to make them feel that, that they should do better, but you're not going to stop feeding them. And you're not going to turn them over to the police, right? You're going to sort of do what you can. And that's what China's doing.
And they've dangled in front of the U.S. the prospect that they would be helpful for years now, and yet in the end, they really haven't been.
They don't have the same calculation we have. They would like to see denuclearization, but the way in which we get there is completely different, right? They believe in international engagement. We believe in not engaging. They believe in not sanctioning and opening dialogue. We believe in sanctioning. So we're approaching it from opposite ways. But understanding the system more and not listening just to the rhetoric and speaking to the people that sort of really, that are really running the relationship would have helped us to realize earlier on, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we're not going to get anything out of China on North Korea.
Now, a key question tonight, if Kim finally develops a deliverable nuclear weapon, is he dangerous enough, unstable enough to actually use it? Most analysts believe he would not launch a nuclear weapon just to provoke, but he could do it if he's desperate or if there's another standoff like the one he had with South Korea last summer. He could miscalculate in an instance like that, Wolf, and that's what makes this situation so very dangerous tonight.
As it did in Libya, the U.S. is taking a lead-from-behind approach to problems in Asia, and this has been the case with North Korea. There has been very few initiatives to try to deal with North Korea. The whole thinking has been let the Chinese deal with it, and the Chinese have been playing a double game when it comes to North Korea. On the one hand, they say that they want a peaceful, non-nuclear North Korea, but on the other hand, they export strategic nuclear missile launchers to their key regional ally.
And they do this for a number of reasons. Some of them are historical, and some of them relate to the links between the Chinese and the North Korean militaries, whose relationship was forged in blood during the Korean War. It's been enhanced by business relations, and the Chinese and the North Korean militaries share perceptions. So, although this is not in China's long-term interest, certainly not in our interest, but the Chinese have been arming the North Koreans.
The existence of this crisis has been useful to China as a source of leverage with the United States. So certainly since the start of the current cycle of nuclear or confrontation over North Korea's nuclear program, going back to 2002, China has sought to position itself in relation to both North Korea and the United States as the arbiter, as the country that will bring North Korea to the table, prevent the crisis from erupting into conflict, and so on. But when push comes to shove, they've been unwilling to apply the kind of pressure to the North Korean regime that would be necessary to have any hope of persuading them to give up their nuclear weapons programs.
China has not exerted the kind of leverage over North Korea that many Americans and many others around the world would think they have, because North Korea is highly dependent on energy and food, just for 2 things.
Fuel oil comes primarily from China. Food, of course, that would impose terrible costs on the North Korean population.
The energy that China provides to North Korea, none of that was touched for the nuclear test. And I was told by Chinese analysts, if there's a 4th nuclear test, it won't be touched either. The only way that you would see a very serious reaction from China would be if it were to be a nuclear test on the border, if it would have direct security implications for Chinese.
Without Chinese acquiescence, the North Korean regime, I think, couldn't survive, certainly in its current form. What would happen if China cut that off is not clear. It could be unpredictable. It could be a collapse that would result in conflict. And in part for that reason, the Chinese don't want to take that risk. But they could do a lot short of cutting North Korea off entirely that would put pressure on the regime, but they haven't been willing to do that.
The other thing about basing our policy on China is that while we are engaging in a sanctions regime, China is ensuring that North Korea is not only economically viable, but has undergone growth since 2009. So the North Korean economy has year on year had growth. I can get you do you want me to give you the figures? So we're waiting for China to, I don't know what, to use its leverage, and the facts on the ground show us differently.
They've been giving the North Koreans the one thing that they needed most to develop nuclear weapons and long-range missiles, and that is time. During the Beijing-sponsored six-party talks between North Korea and 5 other countries, including the United States, China used that time to give the North Koreans the ability to develop their arsenal. And the United States didn't do anything to stop this.
It's going to lead to a situation where we're getting essentially a de facto nuclear North Korea that is also economically viable. So North Korea is not the economically backward, place that we assume it is. I've been there 6 times in the last 5 years.
So this hope that somehow North Korea is going to collapse someday and run into the hands of South Korea and the United States is that's not going to save us from nuclearized.
No, we've been basing our policy on this sense that a country like North Korea, without proper democratic accountable institutions and a functioning government that's willingly and blatantly violating international norms with regard to nuclear proliferation, we just, in our American minds, we just don't understand how that kind of a regime can continue to exist. But for China to keep that type of regime afloat is a drop in the bucket. It doesn't cost China that much.
Well, if there was a moment for preemption in North Korea, it was probably 2003, when the Bush administration was, of course, more focused on Iraq. Up until 2003, the North Korean bomb material, or at least the vast majority of it, was all in reactor fuel, inside a nuclear reactor, in a place where it could not be immediately converted into a weapon, and we knew where it was, and we could watch with satellites, and also inspectors. Then the North Koreans kicked out the inspectors, reprocessed the plutonium, separated it chemically from all the other reactor waste products, and then it's a small enough amount of material they could put it wherever they want. So we don't know where it is any longer. And so they have probably 10 bombs worth of material.
And the days that a deal could be done where we give them, X amount of heavy fuel, et cetera, in return for them making verifiable steps towards denuclearization, we might be past that. Because they've managed to actually keep their nuclear weapons and survive. Remember, surviving in North Korea doesn't mean that people are eating. It means that the regime is in place and is giving the minimum amount to its people to sort of keep them subservient. You don't need that much money to keep a place like North Korea alive if you're only worried about the elites, right?
Nuclear capability is their ultimate insurance policy, because when all is said and done, the United States and its allies have never attacked a nuclear power. And when Libya gave up its nuclear program, it went down the hill.
They would be dumb not to have nuclear weapons after Libya, Iraq.
And so it just be my judgment that North Korea is not going to get rid of this, because the regime, this is both their insurance policy and it's their legitimacy with their own people, in a sense that despite all the privation, we're a strong country.
That they feel that nuclear weapons are their only security. And part of that is because they don't trust China to come to their aid. They don't trust that China will engage in war with the U.S. over them. And they need nuclear weapons in a way to control China, because they continue to get assistance from China, right? If they didn't have the nukes, if they weren't as unpredictable as they were, that would be harder to come by. And now their entire national narrative, you would have read about Songun, it rests on nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are the means to eventually getting economic development. They're not seen as something which will impede economic development. They are necessary for the survival of this country. And the sense is that, yes, that without nuclear weapons, the country won't survive.
They lose this, the Communist Party in North Korea is gone. So I think that's a death sentence for the North Korean leaders, and so they're going down the nuclear route, and my guess is nothing can divert them, that we're going to have to, unfortunately, deal with that reality.
And this is a grim reality indeed, because, as our experts now explain, a nuclearized North Korea may well spark a new and highly destabilizing proliferation of nuclear weapons across the length and breadth of Asia.
동맹 나가자고 하신 경의하는 원수님의 호소를 휘끓는 심장마다에 받아안고 허무당당히 행진해 나아가는 열병대어.
U.S. invulnerability to North Korea gives us more freedom of action, gives us the confidence to be willing to threaten nuclear weapons. Once North Korea is able to counterattack against the United States, once North Korea is able to retaliate against us for our using nuclear weapons against them and hit San Francisco, then Japanese confidence and South Korean confidence go down. Essentially, the question is, would the United States be willing to sacrifice San Francisco for Seoul?
The potential exists, if North Korea continues to develop these weapons, that there could be proliferation of nuclear materials outside of North Korea. There could be a case in which North Korea could sell them to terrorists, not only states, but also non-state actors. And in a worse case, they could actually be used. So I think that China is very fearful of this outcome, and also the potential that other nations, such as Japan, could go nuclear.
A North Korea that can hit the continental United States with nuclear weapons is a North Korea that will lead certainly Japan and maybe South Korea to reevaluate their own decisions about nuclear weapons.
So I think the most likely reaction you would get is a nuclear-armed Japan, a nuclear-armed Korea.
Up until this point, Japan has flirted with the idea but always backed off. It's always chosen to rely on the U.S. security commitment. South Korea had a nuclear program in the 1970s, and we shut it down.
Other countries, even ones we don't expect right now to do this, like Indonesia, might see a need for their own nuclear weapons. Military buildups across the region. American friends feeling deserted by a country they thought had promised them mutual interest in mutual security. And then every other American ally around the world is going to ask, well, if the Americans will pull the plug on that alliance over there, why should we be confident about our alliance? And pretty soon you're going to have countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and the United Arab Emirates wondering if they need their own nuclear weapons as Iran progresses towards a bomb. A country like Israel even more tempted to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities since it can't necessarily count on the United States to have its back. Countries like Germany and Poland reassessing whether they can get by without nuclear weapons, especially in the face of Putin's Russia. And where does the whole thing come undone? And we're back to the past. We're back to the way the world used to operate when the great powers competed. There was anarchy, there were no lasting, durable alliance networks, and they wound up in war quite often, just as 100 years ago in Europe before World War I. That's what I fear this retrenchment strategy would become. In other words, it could begin as, in our mind, a limited retrenchment, but the rest of the world could interpret it as abandonment, and that would lead to more extreme behavior by friends and foes alike.
China has a number of reasons for aiding nuclear weapons proliferation around the world. One of them is that the Chinese think that the spread of nukes is inevitable, so they might as well make friends during this process.
China is a major proliferator of nuclear weapons technology.
Also, they do this because they understand that the North Koreans and the Iranians keep us off balance.
Back in 2003, when Libya gave up its nuclear programs, among the documents that were discovered as part of that program were Chinese language documents showing how to make a small nuclear warhead.
In the case of Libya, apparently when the Libyans were forced in 2003 and 2004 to turn over the elements of their nuclear program that they had purchased from A.Q. Khan, the Pakistani nuclear scientist, among the things that they turned over was a design for a nuclear weapon, which apparently was a Chinese design.
China transferred all that Pakistan needed for a splendid nuclear weapon, and then the Pakistanis merchandised that around the world, including to the Iranians, and with Chinese backing. What did we do? We did nothing about it. We shut down the Pakistani network. We did nothing about China.
They claim they've been abiding by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but we know that they stole some of our nuclear designs, gave them to the Pakistanis, and helped Pakistan develop its own nuclear weapons in violation of the NPT. And we know that because Pakistan then gave those designs to the Libyans, and we found them in Libya. It was our designs with Chinese characteristics on them.
So China perhaps has gotten a little tougher about proliferation than it was 20 years ago, but most of the major proliferation problems in the world right now track back to China.
This brings us full circle to Chinese nuclear espionage against the United States that was carried out in the late 80s, when China penetrated our nuclear weapons labs and was able to gain access to secrets of every deployed weapon in the U.S. arsenal, including the W-88 warhead, which is the center of our submarine-launched ballistic missile warheads. So secrets were stolen by China in the 1990s. Those secrets were then passed on to China's ally Pakistan, and then the nuclear supplier network headed by A.Q. Khan then proliferated those secrets around the world, including to the most dangerous rogue states today, Iran and North Korea.
For more than a decade, North Korea and Iran have essentially had a joint venture on nuclear weapons and long-range ballistic missiles, and the Chinese have been in the background aiding North Korean proliferation. This is the nuclear chain reaction.
Many people have said that China is unwittingly supplying North Korea with military technology and weapons.
The fact that the border is very porous means that you can't really say the government in Beijing was deliberately providing nuclear supplies to the government of North Korea so much as there's a whole lot of companies in China that do this type of work and that are treating North Korea as it is, a normal country with which China has a relationship, a normal relationship, right?
I disagree with that. It's clear to me that there are close relations between the Chinese military and the North Korean military, and that whatever China says publicly about their relations with North Korea, they have a sub-rosa military connection that remains strong and that is supplying this rogue regime with some of the most deadliest weapons on Earth.
We complain about North Korean nuclear weapons proliferation and its sale of ballistic missiles around the world, but we have to remember that China opens up its air bases to permit the North Koreans to transit this stuff through its territory. We don't do anything about this. You know, we say, oh, this is North Korean proliferation. Well, in a sense, technically it is, but it's really Chinese proliferation, and the North Koreans are merely the surrogates.
Several years ago, the North Koreans conducted a military parade at one of their anniversary celebrations, and as part of that parade, they showed off a series of 6 KN-08 ICBM mobile launchers. These missile launchers were delivered to North Korea by China. Now, the Chinese defended the transfer when it was discovered that they had violated UN sanctions by claiming that these were lumber haulers. But it's clear that the proliferation by China to North Korea continues unabated. The Chinese have been the main suppliers of missile technology, and now we have North Korea, a rogue state which has threatened to fire nuclear missiles at the United States with Chinese-made ICBM mobile launchers.
이것은 선제 핵타격으로 미군의 군사 정찰 능력을 제거하려는 것이다.
제3 여객 직격선은 북에서부터 미국의 캘리포니아주 최남단에 있는 포인트 로마 해군 기지까지 그어졌다.
The United States has been hesitant to confront China over proliferation. We don't want to anger Beijing leaders. But when some American city is a radioactive slab, it's not going to be good enough for an American leader to say, I could have done something about this, but I didn't want to anger the Chinese. Well, personally, not offending Beijing is pretty low on my sense of priorities.
All of this stuff ultimately flows back to China.
When North Korea and Iran begin selling nuclear missiles to other hostile regimes, then the United States is going to be facing a virtual global whack-a-mole challenge. Endless wars, endless challenges with nuclear-armed states.
Unfortunately, nothing has been done to stop China's proliferation of strategic nuclear technology.
We should be demanding that China stop support of North Korea's nuclear weapons proliferation. China permits Iranian technicians and scientists to transit through its airport on the way to Pyongyang and back. Every single test of a North Korean nuclear weapon has had Iranian technicians on site in North Korea. Take a look at a map. How do the Iranians get to North Korea? Well, we know that they've been transiting through the Beijing airport. We know this. We track these guys. And what do? We do nothing about it. So we're not freezing the Iranian program at all. It's going full speed in the hills of North Korea.
We are on the onset of an age of nuclear terrorism. We see Pakistan crumbling while it builds more and more nuclear weapons. Why does Pakistan have nuclear weapons? Why does it have the missiles to deliver them? Because of China. We've been in a near 30-year dialogue with the Chinese government trying to arrest this behavior that is supporting not only Pakistan's, but North Korea's and Iran's future nuclear capabilities. China refuses to listen and respond. When a nuclear bomb goes off on some highway, either inside or outside the Beltway, chances are a lot of those components on that bomb are going to say made in China.